Welcome all to the first installment of the 2026 ATLT Insight Series. I am Eme Gisore from All Things Labs and Testing, and it is my pleasure to open today's session. As people are filtering in, I will give a brief overview of ATLT and the speaker and the particular webinar topic that we have today. So welcome. Do share with those with whom you know have signed up and would like to join, and we will begin. So what is ATLT? All Things Labs and Testing, ATLT for short, is a transformative platform dedicated for driving excellence in laboratory science, accreditation, and testing technologies. We aim to unite experts to share best practices, showcase breakthrough technologies, and collectively address the challenges that hold our sectors back. That is agriculture and food, water and irrigation, environment, engineering, mining and energy, forensics, and ICT, which all form the backbone of Africa's sustainable development. The Insight series is crafted around the theme Growing Africa through Quality Testing, and it is anchored on 4 pillars. Firstly, thought leadership, where we share knowledge and foster conversations on best practices, innovation spotlights, highlighting emerging technologies and their transformative impact, knowledge exchange, sharing proven solutions and best practices that work, and lastly, industry challenges that tackle sector-specific barriers to growth and development. We are honored today to be joined by an expert who sits at the intersection of global supply chains, value creation, and the international integration of farms with a dedicated focus on Africa. Her work has shaped the international strategies of numerous corporations and policy institutions worldwide, and we are privileged to have her share her insights with us today as she develops a policy agenda to remove obstacles for agriculture exports from Africa, while also advocating a differentiated trade policy approach that creates economic incentives for export of processed outputs. Thus, it is my genuine pleasure to welcome Professor Nachum to the virtual stage. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Amy. A pleasure to be here, and thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to share my thinking about the agriculture business in Africa, its nature, and what I regard as the major blocks or bottlenecks for its future development. So let me share my screen, and then we'll get started right away. Just a second. I think that's the one. Yeah. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now, and I'll put it just on show mode. Okay, so the export performance of Africa agribusiness sector, a policy agenda for change. I'm coming to this topic from the very terrible frustration that I have looking at the agriculture sector of Africa closely, which I've done during the last few years I've been spending in Africa. So if we think about comparative advantage in agriculture, and then think about this in relation to Africa, the two most important factor that determines comparative advantage in agriculture are land abundance, land availability, land quality, and weather conditions. So looking at Africa from this perspective, so in terms of land, you probably have seen this map many, many times, but it's such a telling one, yeah? Because you can put half the world inside the size of Africa, and there still will be empty slots left, as you can see, yeah? So we have China, the southern and central part of the continent, India, the eastern part, Eastern Europe, most European countries, together with the UK, Kingdom of Madagascar, the US, yeah, occupying this. And as you can see, still empty spots to fill up with other countries, Japan here. So in other words, this map tells a story, right? Yeah, Africa is huge. in terms of land mass. Now, more important for agribusiness, it's not only a lot of land, most of it is arable land. There are estimates that about 50% of the world arable land is in Africa. I've heard even higher estimates, about 60%. But however we turn it, it's a lot. It's the largest share of the world. And importantly, this land is uncultivated, which means there is a gold mine here to be exploited. It's not forested, and as in many other parts of the world where there are huge issues about for deforestation and restrictions on that, and it's not protected in any way. So it's just out there in order for to be used by agriculture. So, and here you can see the story again in just by numbers. They have basically the same idea. So you can see that Africa, sub-Saharan Africa and MENA, which most of it is on the continent because the Middle East countries are very small in terms of land size. So if you put the two together, we're getting about 14,000 square kilometers, much higher than any others, including East Asia, Asia and the Pacific, which is the second largest. So in terms of land, it's a very fertile.
Apologies, just give us 1 second and she'll come right back in.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. There have been some technical issues. Let me reshare my screen and we continue just where we left. and forget, pretend that it never happened. Okay, so yeah, we looked at how abundant Africa is in terms of land, and we kind of got disconnected when we spoke about weather conditions. So as I said before, we got disconnected. The weather conditions across Africa, and you can see it here on the map, are so vast and diverse that they allow to produce 80% of the crops consumed around the world. So it's really a huge comparative advantage. Most importantly, most of the fertile land is in area with rainfall and sunlight all year round. So these are the blue areas and some of the green ones, which means this enables stable supply all year long, which is a huge advantage. Not many parts of the world have this anything close to this. So with all these put together, that led many to suggest that Africa should not only feed itself, but the rest of the world as well. So that sounds very encouraging. But if we look at the reality, what are we seeing? Something very different. Yeah. So yeah. Africa cannot even feed itself, let alone the rest of the world. We import more than $1 billion value of agricultural products every year. And in terms of serving the rest of the world, if anything, the share of Africa in world agribusiness export has shrunk by half since independence of most African countries. So this conflict between the comparative advantage and what is actually happening on the ground is what motivated me to look into this more deeply and trying to understand what is going on here and what we could possibly do in order to amend this unfortunate situation. I came up with a policy agenda for change that includes 4 elements for it. And let me just show them, and then I'll say a few words on each of them. So one thing to notice about this policy agenda for change is that it puts together a domestic policy to develop export capabilities, suggesting that this must be the first step. Before we do that, we cannot talk about export. The local the agribusiness sector is so underdeveloped currently that it can't sell even many proprietary farmers cannot sell even in the village, let alone outside the village and let alone to export. So that must be the first step to improve the state of the agribusiness sector before we can talk about exporting. And then specific policies designed to encourage export. So here are the 4 specific policies that I would like to speak about. Access to capital, land ownership on the domestic arena, and on the cross-border activity on a global basis, focused policy measures across geographies and crops, and trade policy in the service of creating incentives for upgrading. Some of these issues have been discussed. Some of them have been discussed extensively. In relation to some of them, there have been many efforts to amend them over the years, but the situation on the ground has not improved, suggesting that the attitudes towards these policies were inadequate, or the actions that were taken were inadequate, really calling for a fresh look into them and trying to design a better approach and a more effective one. The other issues on the agenda here have hardly been in the discussion, although I find them extremely important. So let me walk you quickly through each one of these 4. So access to capital, domestic policy access to capital. So it goes without saying that we can't do anything without capital, but the agribusiness sector is particularly deprived of capital. So there is both shortage and the little capital that is available is hugely costly. So take a look at the numbers. Yeah, the agribusiness sector receives about 1% of commercial lending, although it contributes 20% of GDP. So there is a terrible distortion, the mismatch here between the significance of the sector and the amount of capital that it receives. It accounts for about 40% of government expenditure, The governments are very, very geared toward industrialization and the development of the manufacturing sector. My argument is that this is not the right approach for Africa. And I'll talk more about this towards the end. The thinking that Africa will develop just like all other countries or like Asian countries have developed is inappropriate and inadequate. Africa needs to find its own path of development, a path that is consistent with its own comparative advantage, not to try to emulate others. But the thinking by government seemed to be very much dominated by this approach. That this made miracle in Asia, so it will work also in Africa. We just need to pour more and more resources into manufacturing. As manufacturing, after all those decades, accounts for less than 10% of Africa's GDP, suggesting that it's maybe not the right path for us to progress. But anyway, the bottom line is that the agribusiness sector does not have money. Now, the cost of the little capital that is available is about double of the rest of the economy. Now, the cost of capital, as we all know, is very high in Africa to begin with, but for the agribusiness sector is even higher. And so is a general, one major reason for this is that there is a general reluctance to lend money to the agribusiness sector for two main reasons. One is that it's a high risk sector, and this is correct. It is very risky because it's subject to the vagary of the weather conditions and the environmental issues that are completely beyond our control, and our ability to predict them is very limited. So there are risks that are specific to the agribusiness sector and make it a particularly risky sector. But to accentuate this, there is a severe absence of collaterals in the agribusiness sector, which means that it's not only high risk, there is also no safety nets to protect investors in case that they will not see back the money. And a major reason for that, which will be the second point I will be talking about, is the lack of, is the inadequate association of ownership to land. So farmers all around the world typically use the lands or pastorals, their live animals, as collaterals for loans, for getting loans. Our African farmers cannot do this because most of them are cultivating lands that is nowhere officially belongs to them. So they cannot use it as a collateral. So there are some suggestions as a result of this situation, this dire situation. There is financing gap in Africa's agribusiness sector of $65 billion annually. So, now when the U.S. cut U.S. aid for $12 billion annually, the whole Africa was in a turmoil. We are talking here about $65 billion, and hardly anybody says anything about this. So this is a terribly dire situation. And I suggest a number of issues that governments can and should do in order to amend the situation. So to begin, the government is direct lender. As we just said, lending to the agribusiness sector or investment in the agribusiness sector accounts for only 4% of government expenditure. That must go up, and it's a very attractive investment that is likely to pay back very handsome food imports. If I mentioned before that we import food and agriculture produce for more than $100 billion a year. If the government support the development of the local sector so that we can develop our self-import substitution, then this will pay back by the reduction of imports. So there is really strong incentives for governments to operate on this. Nigeria used to be the biggest importer of tomato paste until one privately owned Nigerian companies developed a business to produce this locally, and the country saved as a result of that by some estimate $400 million a year on one product. Nigeria was the world's largest importer of tomato paste. So here is just an example of how much the import will make up for the reduction of imports will be the return for the investment of governments in the development of local sector. So that's one way for governments to to operate. The second is the governments as collateral providers. I just spoke about the issue of lack of collateral and its implications for the ability of farmers, of agricultural businesses to lend money. But if the government steps in and offers collateral, then this will encourage the private sector to lend much more to the agribusiness sector. And the third and last issue, which is really particularly interesting, is the government encouragement of non-traditional sources of capital. But this, I mean, venture capital, micro-lending, and all this kind of group of things that has actually been booming recently in Africa. And the statistics show that Africa has become one of the most attractive area in the world for this kind of capital investment. But government create more enabling conditioning and more conditions and more encouraging conditions in order to further support the development of this investment. Most of it is coming from overseas, and these foreign investors confront substantial challenges when they try to enter a continent that they don't understand and don't really and have difficulties making sense of. So that's about access to capital, the first one. The second part of domestic policies is land ownership. So I mentioned this already, but just with the support of some numbers to show the magnitude of the problem. Undocumented land is estimated to account for about 80% of Africa's arable land. Now, this includes communal land ownership, particularly common in pastoral societies, as you know very well, which complicates the issue of ownership even further. So that means that most farmers cultivate land that does not belong to them officially. In addition to that, there are high costs of land registration and land transfer. The cost and time of land transfer doubles in that of the OECD average. So really a very, very dire situation here too. These undermine the use of land as a collateral, which I mentioned already, practically exclude this possibility. More important, just as important, it diminishes incentives to invest in lands upgrading, and it creates barrier to consolidations. So, however we turn this, and we know the soil degradation is a major issue in Africa, and this is one of the reasons. If it doesn't belong to me, why would I make an investment to upgrade it and to maintain that it will remain productive over time? I'm not even sure, I don't know how long I will be able to continue cultivating it. Now, barriers for consolidation, the size of African farm is tiny in comparison to everything that we could possibly think of. The next one is Latin America, where average size of farm is 10 times that of the average in Africa. There are substantial barriers for consolidation, in addition to the tradition of splitting the land over generations, and that shrink the size of the land even further. But as a result, this arrests the natural process of consolidation that would have happened naturally had there been the conditions to allow this to take place. So, Now, the policy response here are really very, very straightforward, and this is something that only governments can do, because only the government has control over the entire land in its own country. So actively address land ownership. And now, fortunately, there are some examples of countries that have done this fairly successfully, at least on small scale, at least as a beginning, but they offer some example to learn from and perhaps emulate and build on to develop it further. So Ethiopia the government issued land certificate for 20 million farmers. Malawi redistributed 15,000 hectares. Rwanda mapped 90% of the country communal land using satellite imagery. The advanced technology really makes this, for the first time in history, probably more feasible and more doable, because without that, it would have been really almost impossible to do anything. So, so this is really, there is an urgent need to fix this, because I think that until this is fixed, it will be almost impossible to move the sector forward. And then improve administrative processes. So Kenya used blockchain registries in order to reduce the tilting for, look at the numbers, yeah? $1,200 to $50. So we are talking here about a different world altogether. Again, technology is really so much to our help in this regard, and we're so fortunate to be able to have this advanced technology that will enable us to improve on this. Governments must take action here. They must take action. So that's about domestic policy. So just to reiterate this, access to capital and land ownership. Moving on to the cross-border policies. The first one, focused and targeted. But by this, I mean, they're generic, there is no policy or insufficient or very limited policy actions that are really guided by thorough analysis of comparative advantages. You know, we have 55 countries. Each of them has weather condition and arable land and that is suitable for slightly different or very different type of agriculture crops. It's not reflected in government policies, or if to the extent that it is, it's insufficiently reflected in government policies. And that leads to generic policies that are targeted to the sector as a whole and doesn't help anybody. Particularly, these policies do not maximize opportunities for scale and for learning, which are really the critical things that we seek to achieve via export. Now, what should be done on this aspect? So, there is a need for targeted policy by geography and by crops. It almost goes without saying that we need different policy responses to if we want to encourage trade within sub-region of Africa, removal of trade barriers. For example, the East Africa community has done a very, very successful job in this regard in relation to dairy trade, increased dairy trade in the East Africa region by hundreds and hundreds of percentages during a very short period of time. But so those countries are close to each other, yeah, by definition. The major barrier for trade are really the policy trade that put restrictions on crossing border. So the focus here should be on the removal of those restrictions. When it comes to globally, really a major issue is the reduction of transportation costs. Most of what we export so far, we'll talk more about this, is perishable. So speed to market is critical. And but this must be the focus of policy directed to encourage global trade. So, for example, Ethiopia developed airline. It has become fundamental for the success of its flour industry. Absolutely fundamental, because fresh cut flowers, in order to grow them in Ethiopia and sell them in Europe, must be transported very, very quickly. Senegal did something similar in relation to high-speed ships, revolutionized entirely the export of Senegal to Europe. So a very, very different policy approach depending on what we want to achieve exactly. And then complies with international environmental and quality standards, which is, of course, a major obstacle for entry to foreign countries. You can't even step in the door, put your foot in the door before you are fully qualified and meet all the conditions. Now, governments need to support this, because going through this whole process is cumbersome, it is costly, it sometimes keep away many farmers from even trying, even starting. The Kenyan government has been doing a very good job on that. Other countries should adapt this example and follow suit. This is critical in terms of enabling more and more farmers to participate in trade and exporting, particularly with outside of Africa, where the restrictions are very high and very demanding. So that's on the geography. On the crop side, again, really policy that is informed by comparative advantage analysis. So, Kenya introduced avocado policy that made Kenya in a couple of years Africa's largest exporter of avocado. It would not have been successful had there not been a basis for it, has there not been a comparative advantage for this. Mali did something similar in relation to mango, gave particular support for this sector, not support that it's kind of separate across all agribusiness, across the whole agribusiness sector. Those who have an advantage, those who do not, everybody put together. Very, very targeted policy, targeting particular sector that are very, very carefully selected, particularly crops that are very carefully selected. So this was the first one of the cross-border policies. The second and the last one is trade policy to incentivize upgrading. So here we are really standing in a terrible situation. Almost as a rule, Africa exports raw material and imports finished goods by paying 10 times, if not more, of the value of what it exports. And examples abound across the continent. I mentioned Nigeria tomatoes. Nigeria is the world's largest exporter of tomato and used to be the largest importer of tomato sauce. And we are talking about a product, turning tomatoes into tomato sauce. It's not a rocket science technology. It's something that women do in the kitchen. So this is something that there is no reason that we will import those kind of things. The same goes to Kenyan tea. 95% of Kenyan tea is exported in bulk as a commodity. Imported back in a nice bag, put in, they don't do anything to it, put in nice bags and then put everything in a box and put a brand name on it and off they go and charge us 10 times more for of this, yeah? Yeah, and then the story of the cocoa, which is maybe 75% of global cocoa grow up in Africa, particularly West Africa, as you probably know. And not only in magnitude, it's also considered as the best cocoa in the world. But we don't produce any of the chocolate that is being sold on the world market at all. Yeah. As a result, Africa received 2% of the billions and billions of dollars of the chocolate market. So this is the situation, and we can go on and on with this, which is extremely disturbing and really must be changed. Governments have the ability to influence at least the pace of change here. The way to go about it is to introduce import policy that is with differentiated tariff structure, in which that is being used in order to discourage export of unprocessed produce and encourage export of processed produce by protecting the sector from foreign competition. So how should it go? Yeah, low import on unprocessed produce will awash the market with unprocessed produce, reducing the prices, diminishing the incentive to deal with unprocessed produce because there are no profits to be made there. On the other hand, high tariff will protect local producers from foreign competition and will encourage them to develop and export processed produce. And and there have been examples of this being done quite with different levels of success in Africa. But this kind of smells of targeted protectionism, which is true, this is what it is exactly. And whether this is desired or not has been subject for ongoing debate. But the debate aside, the most developed markets protect their agribusiness sector heavily. So if the US can and Europe can and Japan can, I can't quite see why Africa should not. It's a little inconsistent with AFTA, but I don't think that it should be a major important because at least so far intercontinental trade in agribusiness accounts for less than 15% of total agribusiness trade. So we should direct this policy towards all the imports that we import from the rest of the world outside of Africa, outside the continent. And I think that this kind of protectionism is absolutely needed and necessary, what they call targeted protectionism. Now, there have been even an extreme versions of that, where some governments just in recent years completely put a ban on export of unprocessed produce, literally a ban. So Botswana just did this with almond, not exactly agriculture, but still Ivory Coast and cocoa. there've been, and a number of others, there've been limited successes to these policies. And the catch here is that it's not enough to ban the export of unprocessed produce. The governments must provide the conditions in order to upgrade for processed produce. And this was not in place in many of the countries that imposed the ban. So they ended up losing both things, because farmers were left without the ability to export the processed food and with the inability to upgrade themselves and process the produce. So kind of leaving them in a complete limbo. So so this is basically the summary, the agenda that I just presented. So let me just wrap this up, and then I will before concluding this talk and giving the floor to you for questions and discussion. I introduced a four legs policy agenda for change. One which combine both domestic policy and cross-border policy. The domestic policy includes access to capital and land ownership. The cross-border policies include targeted, focused policy measures and use of trade policy to incentivize upgrading and processing. In closing, I want to leave you with two close remarks. I think the development of the agribusiness sector is critical for Africa economic development. You see, what we're seeing is this. Yeah, so you see the black column agriculture workforce as percentage of the total. The red or brown, whatever this is, columns are contribution to GDP as percent of the total. So you can see that for sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, the differences between the labor for employment, shares of employment and share of GDP are more than 3 times. Yeah. So, and here you see the breakup for individual countries, yeah, different relationships in individual country. What this is telling us that about half of sub-Saharan African labor force is employed in extremely unproductive activities. If half of the country, half of the continent, the employment on the continent produce 17% of the GDP, it means that they're terribly unproductive. The continent cannot be developed unless we fix this, because we have 50% of the population that is not contributing to the developmental goals, or contributing very, very inefficiently. So this must be at the top of our agenda. Developing the agribusiness sector is really critical for African economic development. And my second point is that I strongly believe that the agribusiness sector should be the engine of Africa economic development, what we call agro-industrialization, which is basically upgrading of fresh produce products. So to the extent that there is industrialization, it starts from agriculture, not from elsewhere. And I very strongly believe in this. And I want to go back to the point that I mentioned before, that the thinking that what worked well in Asia is the right thing for Africa is not correct and should not be accepted as a default. It must be examined very, very carefully. My own understanding of the situation on the ground is that it's not the right way for Africa. Africa does not have the comparative advantage in manufacturing, which explains why, despite of efforts to industrialize the continent over decades, we're still less than 10% of our GDP is generated in manufacturing. So I think we need to change direction and rethink this whole issue with a very, very different perspective and pay much more attention to the agribusiness sector. And I will leave you with that. And I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts about my thinking and your own thinking about where we should go with this. Thank you very, very much. The floor is yours, guys. Oh, I think that there are some questions on the chat, maybe. What overlooked role could multinational companies play in co-creating the policy agenda, particularly in bringing domestic obstacles in bridging domestic obstacle to cross-border competitiveness? Very, very nice question, Brenda. Yeah, multinational companies can really can and should, I would even say, play a role here, and have a great ability to really connect the sector to global market, particularly, as you said, particularly in bridging obstacle to cross-border competitiveness. They have been doing this very successfully in relation to manufacturing all over the world, and it is really a good direction a good way to think about it also in Africa. We see very little participation of multinational companies in Africa agribusiness sector. It's largely indigenous, basically, and this is largely because the sector most of the sector is not developed enough in order to be of any interest for multinational companies. They're not in a situation of so it's not very much that they can help us when it comes to the export of raw material to global markets. We need to develop the sector needs to be further developed in order to enable the participation of multinational companies. But I think your question is very, very well taken and definitely deserve more attention. Yeah. And another one, I would very much like you to ask the question so we get to know each other a little, but if you prefer to do it that way, in what way might firm government society relationship evolve to enforce the ban on raw export while incentivizing upgrading, avoiding the pitfalls seen in other commodity-dependent regions? This is Weston Mandala. It's an excellent question too, Weston. I spoke about this. I'm not sure I can see how firm government society relationship can really work here. I think as far I can, and maybe you can elaborate on this and help me see things that I do not see. But I think the government is taking very decisive efforts here. As I said, they haven't been sufficiently effective because there are no alternatives to the export of raw material. We must develop first the capabilities to process the raw material before we put a ban on export. So I believe that what is standing behind the approach of the government is if they will put a ban, then it will enforce farmers to upgrade. But they need time to make the transitions, and I'm not sure that putting those bans from today to tomorrow could really be an effective motivation. What you have in mind when you speak about firm government society relationship in this context, I'm not quite sure, but if you want to explain, I'll be happy to look into this again. I invite you to raise your hands and maybe speak your questions if you want. But if you feel more comfortable in the chat, that's fine too. Any others?
Raquel, Kenny, you've unmuted yourself. I do not know if you had any queries or if you continue with what's in the chat.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, and I want to just conclude this. Amy, give me a minute. I want to conclude this, but just by thanking you again for coming and listening to the talk. I hope that you found it useful, and I encourage you to stay in touch with me and continue the conversation elsewhere. Thank you very, very much.
There are two other queries on the chat. I don't know if they can speak up. For instance, Frederick.
Oh, there is one new. Yeah, okay. Oh, yes, okay. Okay, who is it? I don't see.
There's a Frederick Karaoke who's inquiring on what are your thoughts on global cooperation like SEED, chemical cooperation. Okay. I don't know if you've seen it.
I'm not sure that we can and should delink ourselves from politicians. You know, you see, the policy agenda I laid down. So to demand yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just kind of got disconnected with responding to the question about deliberating ourselves from governments, suggesting that I think a more effective approach might be for us to work together with governments and try to influence government policies in directions that we find suitable for us, rather than think about ways to get rid of them, because governments can be to our help in many different ways. I think the policy agenda that I lay out in this talk is really very much driven by this belief. So I hope it was convincing for you too. But again, happy to hear different views on this and continue this dialogue. Okay, any other question? Anything new in the chat? Okay. Okay, so might be time to say goodbye. And I really invite you to get in touch with me. I can put my email in the chat. So if you're interested to contact me, feel free to do this, and I'll be happy to continue the conversation with you elsewhere to the extent that you find this useful. Thank you very much again for coming, and thanks very much for your very thoughtful questions. Thank you. Amy, over to you.
Thank you as well. Thank you so much for giving us your time, and thank you to the attendees who showed up. Definitely, this meeting is recorded, so you can always come back and see anything that you might have missed. And Professor Lilac has shared with us her contact, which we're truly grateful. That way, people can reach out if they definitely have more queries. So, as we wrap up today's session, I would just like to extend my sincerest gratitude to you, Professor Lilac, for sharing your invaluable expertise and for your time, and to the attendees. We truly look forward to further conversations and collaborations as we continue to explore ways to grow Africa. So until next time, I'll see you all. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.